So, so we thought we would have a panel discussion on publishing, and especially given the theme of this series of sessions, publishing on Kant. So I'm very grateful to Adrian and Alix for agreeing to be a part of this panel. So rather than me introducing, what I thought it might be useful to do is if we each introduce ourselves a bit and say something about the kind of experience we're bringing to the panel. And then we don't have any kind of pre-planned presentation or anything like that. We were going to, I don't think so, Alix. No, good. We were going to really just have this as an opportunity to ask questions and see where the discussion takes us. So I'll briefly begin and then I'll hand over to Adrian and then to Alix. So I'm mostly chairing this panel, but I also have some experience where I can chip in if necessary. So I'm currently editor of the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society. I'm a member of the editorial committee for the European Journal of Philosophy, which is a bit like being an associate editor, but kind of less formally. So it's kind of more involved than just being, on the list of board members on a website. I'm kind of more involved than that. And I was also associate editor for analysis for several years. So that's my kind of experience on the other side of journal publishing. I have managed to publish some papers on Kant. I've also had many rejected, so can speak a bit to both sides of the experience. Adrian.
Thanks, Jess. I, like you, was once a member of the editorial committee of the European Journal of Philosophy. My subsequent experience is as one of the two joint editors of Mind. So I'm in the same position as you, Jess, in as much as have been generalist journals rather than journals specifically on Kant. And I guess a qualification that applies to everything that I say in this session is that those are the only journals that I can speak about with any authority. It does occur to me, I can't remember how we've billed this, whether we've billed this as journal publishing or as publishing more generally. If this is partly a discussion of publishing more generally, then some other experience that I can bring to bear is that until very recently, I was a philosophy delegate for Oxford University Press, and so can cast a little bit of light on some of the issues that arise with publishing monographs rather than articles. But I simply can't remember.
No,
Yeah.
that's fair enough. I don't think the question arose, but I think,
right.
I think that would be, if people have questions about books as well as papers, I think fantastic. And also questions about, which to go for.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Sorry, yes. Hi. So I'm Alix Cohen, and I'm currently a co-editor of the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. My co-editor is Sasha Golub, who's wonderful. And what else do I... So I've published a few papers. I've got a bunch rejected. I have a lot of papers in my drawers that will never see light of day, which is probably a good thing. I'm on the board of Phil Quarterly, because that's kind of a Scottish-based thing. So, and I guess I've edited a bunch of books and wrote one. I'm writing a second, so I've got some insight into the despair that it can cause. And yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you. So yeah, basically, it all depends on what questions you guys have. So again, if we can use the raise hand function, we'll just open it up and see what we'd like to talk about. Mattis.
Yeah, so thank you. I'm just wondering, so I saw a lot of people who, let's say, got job talks, did have at least a book contract. So I was wondering whether any of you, what your opinion is about how important it is to actually have a book. And then, of course, I mean, if there would be even some advice about how to go about that, that would be very interesting.
I don't know whether either of the other two want to go first. I always find this an incredibly difficult question to answer, actually. I mean, it's partly a question about the relative merits, isn't it, of published articles and the published monograph, and how selection committees might weigh those merits. I never feel comfortable about answering that question, partly because my own primary experience of being on selection committees is in Oxford, and Oxford is a bit idiosyncratic thing. But do either Jess or Alex have any?
Yes, I guess I have. I mean, I have lots of views about things, most of them very misguided, but I know what I tell my own students. So if we're talking about someone straight out of a PhD, my advice has always been that papers are more valuable and on the job market than books. And I mean, that's true, obviously, in analytic philosophy, but I think even for Kant studies, I mean, obviously I'm talking about, so my experience is mostly in the UK and to some extent a little bit in the US now. And it seems to me that a good paper, even a great paper, will bear more weight for an early career person on the job market than a book. That's partly because I've had a lot of colleagues or people around saying, well, books, it's unclear, even if it's with a very good press like OUP or Princeton or something, it's it somehow that there are a lot of books out there and the impact is hard to measure, and not everyone on the hiring committee has the time to read whole books, whereas people will read a paper in a good journal. So my advice would be, if you're early career, to put your energy more in papers than books. But again, that's just my experience.
Yeah, maybe I can just add one thing. Yeah, and just to add, yeah, again, I think these norms will differ depending on the academic culture that you're applying to. So again, my experience is really primarily in the UK. I mean, obviously, there's a difference between a book and a book contract. And I think whilst having a book contract on a CV, shows that it evidences certain things. It's not yet a completed publication. It's not yet a piece of work. And I think I've become increasingly skeptical of I think in progress stuff is positive because it shows that somebody is doing something. But a book that hasn't yet been finished, realistically may come to be, it may never come to be. So I think also, I mean, the question of books versus papers is one. The question of book contract, I think I agree. If there's a book that you really want to write and you have a contract for it and so on, fantastic. I think trying to come up with a book idea when you don't have one that's pressing, to me, doesn't seem like the best use of effort. I think, as Alex said, concentrating on papers is sensible. I mean, other people might have views. I mean, there's a lot of kind of senior people in this meeting as well as junior scholars. So people should feel free to chip in as well. Our next hand is Karen.
Sorry, Jess, just before
Sorry, yeah.
bring Karen in, just to make the other perhaps obvious point, but I think is worth making, which is that what a lot of people do, and what I myself have done in the past, is kill two birds with one stone. So you have got a book project on the go, but there are parts of the book that can be extracted and serve as standalone articles as well. And I mean, I think that's very common for people to have a series of papers that then eventually find their way into a single monograph, you know, perhaps with modifications of various kinds, but the essence of the stuff has already seen the light of day as a paper and then is part of a book as well. So if you are in a position to do both, all well and good. But if you, for one reason or another, feel that you really are making that choice, then I'm inclined to agree with what Alex and Jess have already said.
My
May
partner.
I have
Oh,
little
let me
finger?
just say one thing and then I'll come back to you, Mattis. I was just going to say on what Adrian was saying. My partner thinks of it as singles to the album. So you have a few singles out to kind of raise interest and then the whole album later. But sorry, Mattis.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, just because I mean, I also thought of that, but I'm wondering, is there like, are there any problems? Like, is it like that? Oh, it's already like, I don't know, chapter 1 and 2 are already published as papers, and now like, do you have like, are there any like? Sometimes people say, oh, I'm grateful to the journal for allowing me to use the material. So is this ever a problem? Like, could it be that a journal says, no, you must not use this, or so, or is this like, no, you can always use a paper as a chapter of a book?
I've never known a journal refuse, and I'm not sure why they would.
I mean, if you want, you know, so all journals have the process by which you can formally apply for reprint rights, and authors have privileged reprint rights. In theory, anyone can apply to pay enough money to reprint your paper in their book if they want to. So, you know, there's usually a procedure and different places will have different requirements on how you acknowledge it. That's not a problem. I think in terms of the material already being used, I think book publishers want a percentage of new material in a book. They don't merely want a collection of previously published papers. So it's finding the right ratio. But I think, you know, most of the examples you'll find, there'll be a kind of a handful of previously published stuff, then a bunch of new material in the book as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Karen.
Yes, so I have a different question, and maybe in particular for Alex and the British Journal of History and Philosophy, because I've been told that the British Journal of History and Philosophy is focusing more on so-called minor figures, and I was wondering whether this has an impact on articles on Kant, or whether within the various editorial boards with some discussion as to whether prioritize lesser known figures rather than the big names. So I was wondering if you have something to say about that. Thanks.
Thanks. Hi. Yes. Yes. No, I do. Well, I'm curious to know where you heard that or how you heard that, because I mean, we don't publish. Our aim is not to publish more on smaller figures or underrepresented figures than, you know, the big five. It's just, I think, unlike a bunch of other history journals, we do publish things and we encourage people and work, and we support work on broadening the canon. Is the previous editor, Mike Beanie, kind of spearheaded this whole thing, and we've carried on the legacy. But effectively, I mean, we aim to publish good work, and so whatever we get, we consider on the same. So we don't prioritize. So it's never happened, at least, you know, since I joined, it's never happened that I would say, oh, we can't publish this paper on Kant because we're going to publish something on Du Châtelet or some Chinese person or something. You know, that's not at all how we work. We just get the papers refereed, and then you know, if they're good, then we'll publish them. We don't actually have a massive backlog, so it's never been an issue of space. I mean, if anything, our publishers want us to publish more, and we're kind of reluctant. They want more pages, and we want fewer. So yeah, I mean, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Maybe to to add a kind of related thought, I think it raises an interesting question about generalist journals. I mean, like, so Adrian has the full generalist journal, Ali's kind of general history of philosophy. So my sense is that a paper on Kant submitted to a more general journal than a Kant journal is just it's competing with more things. So I think the kind of thing it's saying is gonna, like, I don't want to say the bar is higher, that's not quite what I mean, but somehow
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, if
Yeah.
I may, I wouldn't put it that way. I don't think the bar is higher.
no, that's not what I mean. I was trying to grope for what I was.
I mean, the way I would put it, just from, is that it's a question of, you know, who's our audience, and so I think a lot about that, and you know, obviously I'm a Kantian, so I like stuff on Kant, but I realize that not everything written about Kant is going to be interesting to non-Kantians, and so that's kind of always my. So obviously, we've published stuff on Kant that is, you know, you would say very Kantian, quite niche, but I try to encourage stuff that's not too embedded within debates, within Kantianisms, you know, footnotes, da da da. So that's kind of the. So it's not so much that it needs to be better, a higher quality, or whatever that means. It's really an issue of, you know, if it's really internal Kantian debates and you need to know what Allison wrote and what Gaia replied to Allison and what Ginsburg, you know, blah blah blah, then probably it's not for us. Unless this can be kind of summarized and put in context, so that someone who isn't familiar with those very, you know, narrow debates within Kantianism can be brought in. And so some papers make, you know, very specific points, but are able to kind of situate them within a larger context. And those papers would work for us as well. But they have to put in more work. And so, and then kind of thinking myself as an author, I try to be aware now, you know, it's been a while, that I'm at this, that I know that, you know, you can assume a lot of background when you send to, say, Kantian Review. And, you know, obviously people are interested in, I mean, I published something there years ago on aliens and politeness and stuff, you know, and, you know, it was a good place for that because it was very, you know, a kind of small point, but it was interesting, and, you know, it's interesting for Kantians, but it, you know, I would have had to put a lot more work and to situate it and make it relevant and, you know, do more of the legwork if I'd submitted it to, say, the BDHP at the time, or to even Mind, or, you know, something very general. So yeah.
Yeah, can I just echo those comments, and in particular, I shared Jess's uncertainty about how to put it. One's tempted to talk about a higher bar, but of course that's not, as you say, that's not the right phrase. But the fact of the matter is that if you're submitting to a generalist journal, you're competing with a lot more stuff. But our own view as editors is that we're only interested in quality. I mean, that's the sole criterion for publication. And so, for example, it would never cross our minds not to publish on Kant just because we very recently did so. I mean, that just would not be an issue at all. But for anybody that's wanting to publish on Kant, the question still remains whether it's a good strategy to go for a generalist journal or a specialist journal. And there are some sort of obvious pros and cons, I think. I mean, if you do publish in Kantian Review, let's say, it may be that you'll get a wider audience, and that there will be more people that are interested in the specific thing that you're doing. And so to some extent, the sorts of things that Alex was just talking about, you know, the extent to which it's a debate within a debate, and the extent to which there are clear, obvious, general repercussions, those sorts of considerations may may kick in, should kick in, I think, when you yourselves are deciding where to submit something.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Konstantinos.
Yes, thank you. Could you suggest some journals that have a really fast turnaround time, apart from the Kant, specialist journals? And I have a hypothesis, and I would like to know what you think about it. Do journals that are general have a harder time convincing Kant reviewers than like Kant specialist journals?
I mean, as far as turnaround time is concerned, I'm sure there are people here that know more about this than I do. I mean, are there statistics on Brian Leiter's website or for this kind of thing?
I'm inclined to say I think it might be a bit of a holy grail, just because I think with the best, some journals probably have slightly smoother internal functioning than others, which allow them to do what they need to do more quickly. I can't, off the top of my head, speak to which ones are quicker or slower. I think the problem is that all of these processes involve external referees, and so much depends on how quick or slow they are. Not just to do the review, but to respond to the request. Because so in the worst cases, you've got the most diligent associate editor you can imagine. They send out an invitation immediately. It takes them 2 weeks to establish that the person they've written to is not getting back to them. Okay, so then they try another person. It takes them 2 weeks to get back to them and say no. Okay, so by the time you've done that a few times, if you're unlucky, it's taken a very long time even to get a reviewer. Then you've got the reviewer, thank goodness, right? Then they've got, if it's a longer paper, 8,000 words, something like that, they're probably going to have at least 2 months to do it, because it takes time to squeeze these things in and people want to be able to spend a decent amount of time. Okay, so 2 months pass and they haven't, they chase them. And if you're unlucky, it's this kind of horrible, once you've put all your eggs in that basket, you want to keep chasing that referee, because the alternative is starting from scratch again. So, I mean, this is just, I think in the unlucky cases, papers take a long time, not, through the best, you try as you might, you can be unlucky. And I think it's probably not helpful to say, oh, well, that journal's really good, because even that really good journal might face those problems. This will sound very pessimistic. In a way, the best you can hope for is what isn't hostage to that fortune is desk rejection. So there will be some journals who keep your paper for 4 months and then desk reject it, and that's very frustrating because you've twiddled your thumbs and got no further. Some journals, I think, are much more efficient at doing that initial sift. So it's always disappointing to get rejection, but at least if it's within 2 weeks, you can get on with your life and send it somewhere else. So that's, sorry, a very long-winded way of saying, I think that might not be the best way to choose journals, unless you've got, I think everybody knows somebody who's told a horror story about how long they had to wait. And if you have that kind of first-hand information, that can be a useful thing to know to avoid a journal. But I certainly wouldn't want to kind of pluck any, name and shame any journals off the top of my head now that I'm not sure about. So sorry about that. Was a long-winded answer to that first question.
Yeah, I don't really have anything more to add. I mean, speaking of the BGHP, we tried our best to be quick, and our average, because we have to, give averages every year and so on, reports. Average is pretty good. But we've had, historical cases where, we tried 12 referees and it's a nightmare, and So we have the odd case that's a disaster. But in general, yeah, we try to be pretty quick, and we're getting better at desk rejecting, which I agree with Jess is a good thing, although it may not seem to be this way when you receive it, and I've received it like everyone else, so I know what it's like. But it's actually a good thing, because usually it's just because it's in a, you know, just inappropriate for the journal, or it doesn't quite fit or something like that. We also have, I mean, one thing that is kind of my pet thing, is people who send us papers. I mean, obviously we get weird stuff that's just, you know, random people just sending crazy stuff. But then we get stuff that's effectively drafts, and that's frustrating, because you can tell just reading through it that it's not quite ready, or that it's not, you know, it's missing bits, or it's not properly grammatical and so on. This can be frustrating. Yeah. And so that kind of clogs up the system also. So I'd like to think that there's, you know, we're this kind of community, and everyone has a responsibility to, you know, the referees, you know, we ask a lot of them, and then hopefully they get their own papers, then refereed by another journal. So it seems, you know, if there's goodwill everywhere, it's a system that works, but it's getting harder and harder. I mean, COVID didn't help, obviously, but somehow it feels like we're still recovering from that. And yeah, it's hard to find good referees, and I understand why. I mean, I'm sent tons of, you know, requests myself, and I just snowed under. So it's difficult, and that's something that as a community I think we need to address.
Yeah, I echo all of that, but it's also relevant to your second question, which was a question about referees, wasn't it? And I don't think there's any reason to suppose that it's harder for those of us involved in generalist journals to get referees to look at work on Kant than it would be for editors of specialist journals, which is, I think, what you were asking, wasn't it? So I don't think there's any particular issue as far as that goes.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's luck of the draw. I know I accept referee requests when I feel it's an appropriate topic, I have the time, I don't have other things piling up, and I always say no if I know I don't have time to do it. Or if I look at it and I'm like, well, I don't really know the topic. You know, and I'm sure it's kind of similar for most people. So yeah, I'm trying to, I mean, my assumption would have been that people are more likely to say yes to the top 5 just because they like the prestige of being a referee for one of the top 5, but I'm not sure how true that is, to be honest.
I mean, actually, there's a fair point that you're making, Jess. I mean, if you're relatively junior and get a request to referee for a prestigious journal, that is itself quite a nice thing to put on your CV.
Yeah. Yeah, that was my first reaction when I heard your question, was that it's probably the other way around.
It might, I mean, if anything, it might be the other way around. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
But I think these probably aren't the things to worry about from the perspective
Sure.
of submitting papers.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, great. Sorry. Tekla.
Thanks so much for this panel. My question is a little bit about referees as well, and how to ensure that they are kind and sensitive when reviewing a manuscript. I personally am a disabled author with multiple sclerosis and an anxiety disorder. So when I submit my manuscripts, I always ask for a disability accommodation from the editors and referees, asking them to be extra supportive and encouraging. And I'm curious, with the journals and university presses that you've been involved with, do you have policies to facilitate those kinds of requests? And how do you maybe train or encourage the referees to be sensitive when giving feedback on a manuscript?
Perhaps if I can go first, I have to confess I'm not aware of us ever having received a request like that. But I hope that, you know, we would take such a thing seriously. What I can say is that we do sometimes, I mean, it's extremely unusual, but it does sometimes happen that a referee's report comes back that's just downright nasty, or objectionable in one way or another. And we think that it would be unfair for anybody to be on the receiving end of that. And it's not unknown for us to send the report back to the referee and to ask them to recast it. If they're unwilling to do that, we have the prerogative of sending an edited version to the author. If we think there's stuff in there that would nevertheless still be of some use to the author, we can take up the vitriol, and I would occasionally do that. But we'd always try to get the referee themselves to recast the material in the first place. And actually, we wouldn't send an edited version without letting the referee know that's what we were doing. But very, very occasionally we've been in that position. The other thing that we quite often do, more frequently, so even in the case of a report that we think is, hits just the right tone, when we're sending an author the referee's report, if it's an invitation to revise and resubmit, if it's not a simple rejection, it's not unknown for us as editors to say, look, here's what the referees have said, and it's for you to take into account. We don't necessarily endorse everything in these referees' reports. And if you do choose to revise your piece and resubmit it, you're at perfect liberty to tell us why you have decided not to make various changes that the referees have requested. The referees are only acting in an advisory capacity. The final decisions are made by the editors, not by the referees. So that's relevant as well, but it would be particularly relevant if there was a reference where there was a really nasty tone, and even when it had been edited, it contained stuff that we as editors thought was maybe a bit unfair.
Yes, we do the same thing. So we edit when necessary, we cut bits when necessary, and after doing this job for a while, you get to know the referees, and so you know the nasty ones, and you just stop using them also. So, and you know who's reliable and so on. So yes, no, very much. Another thing we do is, so because the BGHP is not triple blind, so we know who the authors are, and in some cases, and again, it's kind of a decision of the editorial board, we allow more revise and resubmits than the norm. So it's not unknown for us, for instance, to have 3 or 4 rounds of revise and resubmit with encouragement when we feel, so it's in the case of, say early career scholars, or if it's breaking new grounds in a field that's very new or very uncharted or something like that, or if it's someone foreign, or there are lots of different cases, minorities sometimes, or whatever it is. There can be circumstances where we would give the author a chance to respond. Sometimes it doesn't work in the end, so it's not, we don't have an agenda particularly, but we like to be able to give another chance if it seems appropriate, whatever the circumstances are, and that's allowed because we're not triple blind. So that's why we're actually, as a journal, currently we're against triple blind, because it allows us this kind of leeway of being supportive of in certain cases, and I think personally that's a good thing. But yeah,
I just have maybe one thing to add on the kind of constructive how to help people be better referees. I think this is more from my experience as a supervisor than an editor or anything to do with that, which is, I think those of us who have graduate students or postdocs or whoever that we're working with, I think there's some kind of responsibility to help train them how to be a referee. I mean, you're not born knowing how to referee a paper, right? It's a skill like any other, and it's not one that we don't usually think of it at the top of the list of things that we need to train our students how to do. But I've definitely in the past had cases where, you know, I've been invited to referee something, I haven't been able to take it on, but I thought actually my student would be perfect for that, and kind of had the invitation passed over to them, but then agreed with them, like, once you've written your report, we'll look at it together. And actually, I can think of cases where we've done that, and with the enthusiasm and vigor of youth, the report is pretty harsh.
Yeah.
And we've discussed that it, you know, how to dial it back and make it more constructive and things like that. So I think, I mean, that's not necessarily something editors can do, but I think it's probably something that in the profession we should be thinking more about as a research skill alongside others.
That's an excellent point, Jess. And I think, I mean, insofar as you can generalize, I think it is true that the younger the referee, the harsher they're likely to be, isn't it? So I think that's a really good point. And just for the record, picking up on something that Alex said, I mean, perhaps this is known anyway, but Mind is triple anonymous, and we as editors have no idea of the identity of the author. And actually, that may be relevant to your very first question. I mean, it would depend exactly on what accompanying letter you sent with your submission, but it's not inconceivable to me that our managing editor, who plays a purely administrative role, and who's the only person until the very last stage of acceptance who knows who the author is, it's not inconceivable to me that she might think that it was inappropriate to pass on something like that in case it gave away information about the identity of the author. I simply don't know. I mean, it's an interesting point that you've raised, and in fact, it's a discussion that Lucy and I can have with her at some point, because it could be an issue that's not arisen until now, but may yet arise.
I mean, Adrian, I'd love to know what your experiences of triple blind review and whether you think it's a good thing, because we don't. But I mean, I'm not really sure what the. I mean, I know the obvious arguments for triple blind, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's like a lot of these things. I think there are pros and cons. I mean, you've mentioned the reasons why you don't go in for triple blind, and I can remember having the same conversation with your predecessor, Michael Beanie, and I remember him giving various reasons why he thought that was a better way to proceed. And I think they were good reasons. Mind has been triple blind for quite a while, and the rationale is the obvious one. We like to think that helps on sort of EDI issues, eliminating biases and such like. I mean, it's a really moot point whether it does help. Actually, I mean, and in particular, we're very self-conscious about how much of what we publish, isn't ticking all the boxes that we would like to be ticking, and you always wonder whether we'd be ticking more of those boxes if it was not triple anonymous. But there you go. I mean, that's the rationale.
It's an interesting debate. I think we probably won't solve it right now, but I think disability is a really well, kind of disability and non-native language and these kinds of things are an interesting case, because one is reliant on, so if it's triple blind, one is reliant on editors and referees reading text that they don't know who it's from with a certain charity, because if the grammar or the spelling or some of those things are not great, some people will just not care and just look for the philosophy and think, you know, okay, this can be copy edited. Some people will reject after the first page because they're like, no, not good enough. But of course, you know, when we mark student work, we have that contextualization. So it's kind of interesting. Apart from all the other EDI issues as well, but I think that's an interesting one that immediately shows up in the text that you know, different individuals take different attitudes towards.
I mean, the number of times we've had referees reports where they're like, this is obviously a foreign person, and I'm like, no, they're not. So yeah, whatever that means.
You know, I was never taught grammar at school. So, you know, that it was assumed in my kind of pocket of school year that people would intuitively learn grammar just from reading, and they didn't need to have grammar lessons. So yeah, I'm sure I make all sorts of horrible mistakes. Anyway, let's move on. I want to go to Daniel.
Thanks. Are we out of time?
So our official time is to run no later than 1:30, but we've got
good.
time for a bit more. Yeah.
So I just want to lend a somewhat different perspective as someone who hasn't been an editor, though I have done quite a bit of refereeing on some of the various points that came up. I wanted to echo what the editors were saying in that at one point I was wanting to send an article to a general journal, and to my dismay, I noticed that they had published 3 articles on Kant in the previous couple of issues. And I contacted the editors and asked them, have you had too much Kant? Should I not submit there? And they said, no, we look for quality and that's our criteria. So that's just reinforcing what the editors had said. I think also somebody was asking about, Konstantinos was asking about quick turnaround time. I will say that if, you know, I think people don't realize that they can communicate with the editors and that the editors are generally sympathetic to the people who are applying. I thought at first when I was doing this process that, you know, anonymity and so on and so forth, you just send it in, you don't have any communication. But I had someone advise me that you can't communicate with the editors at a very general level, not try to influence the decision. But I did, when I was coming up for tenure, just let the editor know that I'm coming up for tenure, I'm asking about turnaround time, and one of the editors had said, thanks for letting me know, I'll be sure to send it to a referee that I know will actually get this back to you within the next year or so on, you know. And the other thing was also reinforcing that I don't know, you know, when you have a revise and resubmit and you revise the paper, I don't know if people always know that it's nice to have a tight summary of what you've revised, and then sometimes you disagree and then kind of argue for not having revised it here and there. And if it's reasonable, the editors will take that into account in assessing what you've done. And I think one can communicate these things to the editors. You don't want to overburden them. You should always be thinking that they're incredibly busy and not to give them more work and to get them to adjudicate arguments for you. But editors are people who have been in your position and they're generally sympathetic. And it's okay to communicate about very general issues.
Yeah. Can I just strongly endorse that? Thanks ever so much, Daniel. I think those are all excellent points. And but in particular, if you get an invitation to revise and resubmit it, you're not obliged to do this, but it's standard practice and it's advisable to include a covering letter in which you explain why you've done what you've done, and in particular why you want to hold back from not revising something. And as Daniel says, you know, we don't want to overburden editors, but actually a really good covering letter of that kind is making life easier for the editor, not harder. You know, it's a nice summary of what's going on. It's actually helpful for the referees as well. A piece that's resubmitted will typically go back to the same referees, not not absolutely always, but typically that's the procedure, and it's helpful for them as well to see a summary of what you've done. And you're well within your rights to stand fast and to say, no, I disagree with the referee about this. I think the point that I was making originally was a perfectly legitimate point, and here's why I want to leave it intact. You're well within your rights to do that. And as I hinted earlier, I mean, it may well be that the editors are already on your side anyway, and it's the editors that make the final decision.
I just wanted to add one more point. I'm glad we were having this session. I think it's really valuable, and it's also making me feel horribly guilty about something that I need to referee, and I'm going to do it as soon as we're offline.
The intention was not to make anyone feel bad. No, I just wanted to say about the communication point as well. So, I mean, one can be more or less organized. So I'll give you a more extreme example. So I know someone who, when he submits a paper to a journal, at that time, he reads the journal website and says their advertised decision time, checks out what their advertised decision timing is. And then if he hasn't heard back by that deadline, he will systematically write to the journal to ask for an update on his paper. So, I mean, the lesson from that is it's normal, it's fine. If your paper, if a journal says we aim to get back to you within 3 months and it's been 3 months and a week, it's normal and fine to write to the journal and say, just wanted to check what's going on with this. Often it's a painful story of the kind I already sketched earlier. But a good journal should be happy to be in touch with you and give you an update. They don't always have the power to actually speed things up if there's a problem with referees, but it might spur them to chase that referee one more time and so on.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to pronounce. Is it Rodic?
No, Rodica. Rodica Kreuter is my name.
Sorry.
It was a very good idea to divide the session of the UK Kant Society in twice, in a thematic part, in a presentation, and one about the politics of journals, what to publish in a philosophical journal. My question is, what about the quotations? Are they necessary? It is necessary to make quotation from important, very important persons in a specific field of interest. What do you think about quotation? It refers to the the subjectivity, the claim, so to speak, of the referee, or it is a policy of the journal?
Maybe I can just say one thing about quotations. I mean, if we get a
reference of the book articles of the important persons in this field, in the field you publish.
Right. Okay. So
you submitted the paper in the field. Yes, about it is the paper submitted. What do you think about the quotation, the problem of quotations?
Maybe I was about to answer a slightly different question, actually, because what I had in mind, perhaps I'm misunderstanding it, I mean, one thing that I can say, which I think is worth saying, even if it's not what you're asking, is that if we get a submission that is in the history of philosophy, and so in particular, this would apply to any submission that's primarily about Kant, it is the one point at which, it's one of the points at which we.
But let Adrian say what he's saying, and then if it's not what you were asking, you can try again. Let him just finish.
So my point is, it's one of the exceptions to a word limit rule that we have. So Mind is one of the journals that does specify a word limit. And we say that submissions shouldn't be significantly over 8,000 words. But we do make an exception in the case of submissions in the history of philosophy if they involve extensive quotation. And that's what I thought you were getting at originally. And it is sometimes just straightforwardly necessary in the history of philosophy to include extensive quotations. You just have to see what the original author is saying. But then as you proceeded, I wondered if it was more a question about references to other relevant literature. And I mean, as far as that goes, the only advice that I can give is rather unhelpful advice, I think, which is that you do what's necessary. You know, how far is it really relevant to your argument to call on what somebody else has said? To what extent are you responding to what somebody else has said? I wouldn't myself encourage somebody to have a whole lot of references just for the sake of having a whole lot of references.
I'm not referring to the extension of my quotations, but when I am submitting a paper on the taste, for example, or aesthetics, in Kant aesthetics, well, do you believe it is necessary to quote Paul Geyer's claim of taste, for example, or on philosophy of mathematics to quote Daniel Sutherland's book, or of this kind? So I am asking.
So yeah, so well, if I may jump in, I don't think so. So I think whatever your perception of who's the big person, and you know, I don't think you should feel. I mean, for the BJHP, what's important is situating your claim within debates, and so giving the reader a sense of what your contribution is, and that's one way of doing that. That's an easy, straightforward way of doing that. Like X says Y, you know, Y says Z, and I'm saying, you know, A. So that's, but certainly, and you know, you notice certain papers only cite, like, you know, Alison Guy Wood, and you know, I don't know if it's sometimes it, you know, you don't know how intentional that is, like, oh, I'm citing the big old guys and not, you know, I mean, obviously it's a personal choice who you're reading and who you're responding to, but I think in general you shouldn't feel you have to cite anyone just because you have to, but it's helpful to situate whatever it is you're saying so that whoever reads you gets a sense of the contribution you're making. That would be, for me, more important than feeling you're ticking boxes of referencing people, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. But well, have some weight, this kind of quotations, isn't it?
I don't think
Anyway.
so. I mean, I personally, as an author, I don't do that. I mean, I cite Gaia when, you know, he says something I either agree with or disagree with sometimes, but
yes, thank you. I think like you. I am, yeah, similar with your opinion. Thank you.
I mean, but that's just, yeah, my opinion as an author. As an editor, it wouldn't be a deal breaker. But what is a deal breaker? It would be someone who, you know, says something that's already been said without referencing anyone else. And then you feel that, you know, sometimes you get those papers and it's like people are rethinking, you know, reinventing the wheel in a vacuum. And then you're like, okay, well, can you please, you know, read the literature first? And so that would be more the kind of counter cases of what you don't want to see.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks, Felix. Yeah, what you said sounded exactly right to me. That's great. Thank you. Daniel. Not that I'm the arbiter here, but I just want to say I ditto. Daniel.
Yes, I just, well, I mean, first of all, if anybody publishes anything on any topic in ethics or whatever, they should always refer to my work, but no, just kidding. I wanted to just come back to something that Alik said earlier about a desk rejection not necessarily being a bad thing. One of the best pieces of advice I got when I was in graduate school already was to have, this is dating me, after I mailed off a submission to a journal, print out another copy of it and put it in an envelope with the next journal that I wanted to submit to, so that when I got a desk rejection, I didn't wallow in depression for 2 weeks or 2 months and just turn around and send it to the next journal. Now, I never took that advice, but I kept it in mind, and generally letting something sit for a bit allows you to gain some perspective on it. I would give myself at most like 5 days to reread it, brush it up, and then send it off. But I would have a firm deadline. Don't just sit there and get depressed about it, just keep moving it. So, excuse me. So I just wanted to add that comment. I think that was some very good advice I got early on.
I think that it is good advice. And I think it relates to the fact that, you know, we work hard, we do our best, but I think there is an important element of luck in publishing in journals. You know, the luck of the draw of who your referees are this time, you know, how they see the paper, what, you know, how hungry they are when they read it, you know, all these things, that it doesn't undermine the fact that there is proper assessment going on, but one and the same paper can get very different reactions from different places. And indeed, you know, you might send a paper off to a journal that you're thinking is maybe mid-tier, if there are such things, and it gets a kind of brutal rejection, and then you throw caution to the wind and send it to the top 5, and then it gets in, and you know, I think one has to, you know, take those days of reflection of, okay, is there actually a problem here? And if not, or if you haven't got any useful feedback, you've just got to, yeah, buy another ticket for the draw.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, but I also want to give the other extreme case, which is one of my pet things, which is when people get referees reports. So not desk rejections. Obviously, I agree with Daniel that you should keep at it and not get depressed, because it is a matter of luck in most cases. However, people who get reports and then just ignore them and go on to the next journal. And I've noticed that happening because sometimes I'm the editor and then I end up being the referee in the next round. And I'm like, you haven't changed a word, and completely ignored this report, which, you know, for whatever you think. So I think sometimes, and obviously this is, you know, this doesn't apply to most people, but people just ignore reports. And I think, yeah, some reports are rubbish and some reports are misguided, but there's always kind of something that you could do to improve the paper. And ignoring the reports entirely and moving on to the next journal, I think, is a mistake. Because, you know, it was rejected for a reason. If there's a report, there's bound to be something that can help you clarify a point, or, I don't know, consider potential misunderstandings or something. So yeah, and also, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems, again, it's clogging up the system, and I don't know. Yeah, it's just one of the things that makes me angry.
Just a tiny point to echo that. I mean, I entirely agree with that. And if we at Mind are rejecting something after it's been through a round of revision and resubmission, the fact that it's got that far means that we've seen some merit in it. I mean, there's clearly something there that's of value. One of the things that we often say to the author is, you know, we wish you luck if you submit this piece elsewhere, but we wish you luck if you revise this piece for submission elsewhere. And that's picking up the point that Alex has just made. You know, the fact of the matter is that there is obviously still work to be done on the piece, otherwise you know, otherwise we'd be publishing it.
Do you have another question, Daniel? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm having comments rather than questions.
Oh,
but
yeah, contribution. That's fine.
Strongly reinforce what Alix was saying. What I was saying definitely was about desk rejections. You know, somebody's gone to the trouble of doing the referee. They're doing their best to actually evaluate it. And they are a good pair of independent eyes on your writing. You don't know necessarily how you're coming across. And for you to not take that advice is a big mistake. And I'd also say that in my own experience for revise and resubmit, that there are things that I disagree with occasionally, and then I think it would be a mistake to change the paper. There are other things that are clear improvements, things I need to make clear. And then there are these things sort of in between where I like, this doesn't really matter. Well, if it doesn't really matter, go ahead and change it. I mean, if there's nothing at stake for you on that point, then accommodate and take seriously the feedback you're getting. I too, as a referee, have refereed an article and then it wasn't accepted, and then I got the article again from a different journal and it really hadn't changed at all, and I'm just like perplexed, like, why would you do this? So I think that's really really important. I made a joke earlier, but I wanted to say a bit more about Radhika's claim. That I think Alix is absolutely right. You want to locate yourself in a debate. That's what's crucial. That sometimes requires referring to some people. But if it happens to be that you're focusing on a particular issue that someone is known to have responded to and made a contribution to, then you're kind of forced to interact with that author, whether you want to or not. But that's the larger context is what you need to take into account. Are you locating yourself within the debate in a way that's intelligible to people so they can see what's going on? And then there's some authors that you probably just can't ignore it, or can ignore at your peril or something. So there's a bit of negotiation there on how much I tended to just work through things on my own, and then, I mean, there's just too much literature to work through everything. We're always feeling that, but there are certain limits of who you could or couldn't include. So it's a kind of negotiation, I think.
I'll just say something brief and then go to Andrew's comment/question. Just on the getting the same referee at different journals, I remember a kind of a similar but different case, because I years ago I remember I reviewed a paper for a journal, tried to give what I hoped was a constructive report but recommended rejection, and then sometime later got the same paper back from a different journal. And they made the changes, and it had been quite a substantial change, but it was still kind of recognizable as the same paper. And then it was accepted because it had improved a lot and it was much better. It goes to show it's not unusual actually to get the same referee. You know, there's only so many people working on a particular topic. So I mean, there are kind of instrumental, but also kind of philosophical reasons to take those reports seriously. Andrew.
Thanks. I'm in the car because I have to go and speak at a local middle school in about 15 minutes about the importance of civics education. But I wanted to three things on three of the topics that have come up is super useful discussion. I hope it's helpful to everybody. One is that sometimes I think the author might also want to just give up on a journal, even if it's another revise and resubmit. So we all have horror stories. Mine is that I submitted something to a top 5 journal, and I think I had 3 or 4 revise and resubmits, and each time the referee took 3 months to get it back. And then it ended up feeling like she or he was writing it with me in a strange way. And I was a second-year assistant professor, so I was just like accommodating everything. And it did feel suddenly like it was this jointly authored thing. And then after 18 months of back and forth, they rejected it anyway. And so and then I submitted it somewhere else and it was accepted within another couple of months. So there was this feeling that I should have just decided at some point that referee was in a way too invested in the way the paper came out and changing, forcing me to change all these things. And then in the end, not happy anyway. So I don't know exactly when to pull out, but maybe after 2 or 3 revise and resubmits, you sort of get the feeling that this isn't going to work out, and then you move on. Another thing in response to Radhika that I wanted to say was just, I mean, it is hard to to know who to mention. I mean, I think that the advice that you've been given is right, that you should look for the people who are actively involved in the discussion. One reason not to do the thing where you only cite the great eminences like the Allisons and the Geyers is that the referee is almost certainly not going to be one of them. It's probably going to be some mid-career person who has been selected to be the referee because they're involved in precisely that discussion. And so in some ways, you know, you can't know who the referee is, but you want to at least try to cover your bases and hopefully mention or recognize somewhere in the paper the people who are actively working on it, such that the referee isn't then thinking, well, why hasn't this person noticed my work on this topic? I mean, that's not a great sentiment for a referee to feel, but people do feel it. And then we'll say things like, the author should read my work, which I think, you know, you really shouldn't do as a referee, but it's a natural thought. Like, I was asked to review this. This is very much in my wheelhouse. And yet this person is only mentioning Henry Allison as though nothing has happened since then. So if you're going to mention people, I would say look for the most active mid-career people who are usually sort of on the cutting edge of these discussions. And then the last question was for some of you, Alix and Jess and others. I was under the impression that as a referee, if you get asked to referee a paper that you've already rejected for some other journal, you are supposed to tell the editor that, or even just decline to referee. Is that not your understanding?
If I can speak on behalf of Mind, there is no requirement to do to let us know. I mean, often referees do say, well, actually, I've already refereed this piece for another journal. Is it okay for me? Do you want me to carry on and referee it for you as well? And our response is always, well, yes, please. If you've still got the, you know, if you've got the time and are able to, and that it wouldn't worry us if it had already been seen by that person elsewhere. But certainly we don't require them to make that known to us.
I mean, as a referee, I suppose I've always, if I felt I can't be fair to the paper, if I'm like, I can't see this again, I will just politely decline. But yeah, I mean, maybe this is a kind of broader disciplinary norm. It's not a norm that had been salient to me before, beyond the kind of, if you can't be fair to it, don't referee it. But
I think one of my graduate students had the experience where she was submitting this paper and it kept getting rejected by what was clearly the same person at different journals. So it kind of had this gatekeeping device where that referee was clearly opposed to this paper and was going to just keep shooting it down at multiple journals.
But that's why I think it's slightly, like I said, I think if there's a paper that I would keep rejecting, I wouldn't referee it anymore. But I don't know how concrete the norm is in yeah, maybe there's a blog post in this.
I'm the same way. I mean, if I get asked, I let the editor know I've seen this already, politely decline. I saw this one paper and I just looked to see what state it was in and realized that they hadn't changed at all. But I didn't even communicate that to the editors because I wanted to give them a fair shot at a new journal, even though I thought that they should have taken into account comments. So I was bending over backwards not to gatekeep.
Plus, what's most fun is when you get your own paper to referee, because the journal is so carefully triple blind. And then there is an explicit requirement that if it's your own paper, you should decline, but not tell them why you're declining. Martin, you had your hand up. Do you want to have the last word on this before we wrap up?
No, thanks. It's fine. I actually posted in the chat that my question was exactly the one that Andrew just asked about refereeing one paper multiple times. And yeah, I think that's answered. Okay, I generally wouldn't do it, but it's also impossible to find people to referee. So maybe we should be open to that.
Then Mattis, you get the last word.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, just coming back basically to my first question, and because there was the issue of like how to, or of writing books, and so I was curious whether there are just some general advice about how to write a book proposal.
I mean, Adrian might have more kind of formal advice. I think most publishers say on their website what they want in a book proposal. Some have a form, so like check, and if they have one, do it, because I guess they want it in a certain format. So maybe that's the best short answer, is that they each have their requirements. But Adrian, do you want to say more from your experience at OUP?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I'm not the best person to pronounce on this because of how much is at the discretion of the press editors rather than the press delegates. The delegates get involved at a very late stage in the process, where, you know, once the editors have themselves decided that they think a project is worth pursuing and they want to sign a contract with the authors. But all I can say is that we sign contracts with authors in a range of cases. I mean, sometimes it'll be on the strength of a manuscript that's pretty much already finished, you know, with just a few minor tweaks that are required. And then at the other extreme, there are cases where we sign contracts on the strength of just a proposal, but there's enough in the proposal and the author's got enough of a track record for us to be confident that it's worth pursuing. And so it is, unfortunately, it's very, very hard to know what general advice can be given about this. There's such a wide range, and a much, much wider range than there is with journal publication. I mean, obviously, you're going to get nowhere trying to publish an article on the strength of an outline or a proposal. But you could sign a contract for a monograph on the strength of an outline or a proposal. So much depends on individual circumstances, I think. But I mean, Jess's advice is obviously really good. You know, look at whatever explicit advice is being given as well.
And maybe, yeah, so one final thought is a slight advertisement is earlier this year, because Peter Momchiloff, the king of OUP, hung up his crown at the end of last year. So the Aristotelian Society, we did an interview with him, a podcast, which should be coming out any day soon. And quite a bit of that, we talked about his advice on publishing books and approaching publishers and so on. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that.
And if I can just say so, I mean, I didn't know that, and I'm looking forward to hearing it, but that's bound to be good advice. I mean, you know, Peter Momchiloff is the person that you want to consider. Was philosophy editor at OUP, and that's the really significant role. Yeah.
So we're
Great, thank you.
Out of time. So it just remains for me to thank Adrian and Alix. Thank you for coming along and talking to us about publishing. Really appreciate your time. Thank you again to the VKC people for hosting us. I won't be able to give us, you know, other people have said all the nice thank yous and so on, but it's been great. And I hope you all have a